So Rico would leave the plant alone and scooted it away. At the very least, he could study it and try to figure out what worked and didn't for his little seedling. The seedling, he'd forgot all about it. There was still some clay left on the floor. Rico could smoosh together a second pot. He threw another piece of coal on the fire and got to crafting. Within a few hours, he had another smaller version of the 3.5 or so gallon pot, complete with the appropriate holes. Fresh off the improvised oven, he set it gingerly on the floor, filled it with the remainder of dirt in his bag, and buried the seed in an inch or so down. With the last few drips of local water, he dampened the soil of the seed a tiny bit. Rico set up his bed on the stone slab, a compact blow-up mattress and a little blow-up pillow and a coffin sleeping bag that was good to down about 20 degrees. It was a little too warm for his liner, so he left it in his bag. He hung up his 2 6s on a hanger above him, probably meant for plants, and had one last thought as he looked down at the larger and smaller pot next to each other. I bet both of you want some fresh air, huh? He carefully and quietly set the 2 potted plants out on the stone balcony to cool and get fresh air. And in the morning they would start getting light, even if it wasn't direct. In the distance he heard the faint sound of fly swarm ripping around, eating everything in both plant and animal it could find. Resigning to his fate, he crawled back into bed and zipped up his bag. As a last measure, he zipped up a bug net part over his face. He'd still be able to breathe, but hopefully the bugs couldn't get to him. Hopefully. Chapter 21. Good morning, sunshine. Rico woke up, forgetting where he was for a second, flailing around in his bag. The fire had died down and the sun was rising. He was warm and snug, though, and couldn't really decide if he wanted to get up. Then he remembered his 2 little plant buddies he'd been working on. He flailed around some more until he found the zippers and got himself out of bed. The fire was still going fairly decently, and he kicked in another piece of coal. He had to go to the bathroom like crazy and ran to grab his phone, which was now fully charged. It indicated where the bathrooms were on the map, and he ran to one and relieved himself in a way he hoped wouldn't offend the native ancestors. He remembered the plants again and hurried to the balcony. There they were, a bigger pot and a littler pot, and 2 plants trying to stretch out to see the landscape. They were just a tiny bit short, though. Rico stared in awe as the bigger one, which was maybe only a teenager, at best in plant years, chomped at the little baby one as if it was talking. The littler one seemed to wave and flutter a bit, then chomp back. Little spores or pheromones or something going between the two as sort of a communication, maybe? Rico's tummy, unaware of the situation and hungry, decided to rumble. The 2 plants swung their polka dot bulbed looking heads around and looked at Rico. This startled Rico, and he almost stumbled backwards and fell down. The tinier one waved its leaves around like a child wanting to be picked up. The older one looked standoffish, like it wasn't very trusting. Rico facepalmed. Unsure of what to do, Rico started talking as he went closer. Hi, I'm Rico. He said his name really slow, as if that mattered. The tinier one started chomping and doing a little dance. The larger one looked at him like he was too trusting, but then started slowly doing the same. If I come near you 2, are you going to bite me? The larger one shook its beak and the smaller one nodded. Great, which one of you is lying? He went to the smaller one and went to pick it up. And as soon as his arm got close, the tiny plant bit his arm. Rico recoiled as he was startled, but thankfully hadn't picked up the plant yet, so he didn't drop it and break the pot. The larger plant danced excitedly and started chomping at Rico. Rico looked down at his arm, and through his long sleeve there was sort of a sucker wound. The smaller plant spit something at the larger plant, and the larger plant seemed to breathe it in. "Ah, little fella, you don't have any teeth. I'm going to call you Sucky. Come here, Sucky." He picked up Sucky and held him tight. The small plant didn't try to bite him again and began dancing back and forth happily. The larger plant started dancing also. Alright, let's get you up on the ledge here. There were 2 special spots for pots on the ledge that secured them in really well, sort of like little battlements. I guess you guys must be like little turrets or something, huh? Well, up here you can see the whole theater. Have fun. Rico cautiously got the larger of the 2 and set it in the next battlement over. The special platforms seemed to be perfectly spaced to create a bit of an overlapping sweet spot. Their new spots seemed to make the plants very happy, and the larger one opened its mouth and some perfume or something leaked out. Rico could see several dead bug carcasses inside its mouth and realized how it survived all this time. Wow, you guys can, digest really, really slow if you want to or something. The thought trailed off with no obvious response. Then, as if the plant had a second to think about it, let out a big patooey, and the larger plant spit the bug shells out all over the savannah. Okay, I've got a name for you. You're going to be named Spitty. Spitty and Sucky. The two plants stopped to think about it for a second and then began their little dance once again. The big one with its mouth open. Before long, one of the killer fly scouts came along and landed right in Spitty's mouth. Slam! Crunch. Spitty's mouth closed fast on the fly and immediately got crushed into goo. The plant seemed to grain with ichor oozing out of its mouth. Sucky looked over at Spitty, clearly jealous, and opened its mouth also to emulate. It didn't take too long. Slam! Crunch! Rico whispered to himself, "Great, I've created two little monsters." Then went inside to put his sixes back on and started making more pots for his new plant critters. Not before making some coffee and having breakfast first, though. Chapter 22, The Coming Days. It turned out, if you feed the plants, they reproduce quite quickly. It wasn't more than a few days until Rico had Spotty and Dotty and Carnage asada, which was a plant with two buds instead of one of the normal single ones. There were more varieties of plants growing every day, but he couldn't tell them apart as well due to some of them being twins or behaving in ways he didn't have words for at the time. The plants would eat a few bugs, and the next morning, when he'd wake up, there'd be little seed pods, in the pots waiting. They'd sit there with their mouths open and eat the killer flies as they'd scout and get too close, and every day they'd get a tiny bit bigger. Rico figured eventually the bugs would realize a gap in his defenses and send everything at him, but then he remembered the ancient texts. They can't take anyone out if they have plants without their helper person. It had got too dangerous for Rico to get water by himself, so he brought his favorite plant with him. Carnage asada would be strapped to the back of his motorcycle and ride with him to keep the bugs away or dead. The most Rico had ever seen Carnage asada was 5 or 6 at a time. He held his mouth open until they all landed and got stuck in chomp. So Rico would wait for the bugs to swarm. The bug swarm to be on one side or the other, and then would zip across the savannah to fill up water or to restock until they could make it back to him in time. As soon as he felt like he had enough of these plants, he was going to plant them at his garden home and then came up with the perfect plan. The drone eventually got the whole Mesa stronghold mapped. It had found a way to get on top where Rico set up the receiver and antenna for it, and it was able to recharge the other half of the day and scout much more efficiently. This allowed Rico to get more clay and make significantly more pots. As the pots were baking, he would go run supplies back and forth, but his little basket wasn't enough, so he went and got his wheelbarrow and repaired the tire properly. After rigging up more wheels to balance it, he was able to haul a lot back and forth more efficiently as soon as everything got hauled back to his homestead. Thankfully, he was done barely in time, because the flies had finally figured out what he was doing, and one day he was going back for a final walkthrough and they wouldn't leave. They stayed put right smack in the middle of his path, basically on top of his watering hole to water his plants. Instead of being random and bug-like, they seemed to take on more intelligent and problem-solving qualities. Rico knew his time was drawing near. Chapter 23, Showdown. Rico had the plants set up strategically around his homestead in their little pots. It was sort of a maze of sorts, where the killer flies couldn't get to his home or his plants without having to pass through several of the plants. The plants were also able to cover each other if any of them got swarmed. A few had gotten quite alarmingly large, and Rico was glad he was on their side, because a few of them had basically become alligator size and could even hop around a little bit if they didn't like where they were placed. Rico had toyed with the idea of chaining them down, but he didn't want to be perceived as their enemy and didn't want to get chomped by them. They more or less considered him their dad or some such, but he wasn't about to push his luck. So he made sure that a good stream of water was making it to them, and they would open their mouths and collect the killer flies.